Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to today. My name is Dr. Benjamin Law, and I will be your MC for today. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would first like to say that as one of the co-editors for this book, Sabah from the Ground, the 2020 Elections and the Politics of Survival, I would like to say a very, very big thank you to my other fellow editors and also to the more than 20 authors who worked very hard and diligently for the last 6 months to make this book a reality. I am very humbled to be a part of this experience, and we hope to have a very fruitful discussion today. So before we kick things off, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, which is the head of School of Media and Communication here at Taylor's University, Professor Dr. Kashif Hussain.
Hi, everyone. A very good morning and happy Friday. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Low. I would like to welcome the VIP guests today. Professor Datuk Dr. Danny Wong, Dean of Faculty of Arts, UM. Associate Professor TS Dr. Ramzah Dambul, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation, UMS. Datuk Seri Panglima Dr. Muhammad Salleh Said Keruak, State Representative for Usukan and former Chief Minister of Sabah. I would also like to thank the moderator and the speakers of the session today. The moderator is Dr. Vilashni Somia from University of Malaya, Tony Paridi Bagang from UITM Sabah, Aslam Abdul Jalil from University of Queensland, Dr. Benjamin Low from Taylor's University, Dr. Trixie Tangit from UMS, Dr. James Allen from UMS, Dr. Bridget Welch from University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the recent book published titled as Sabah from the Ground, the 2020 elections and the politics of survival has been capturing a lot of attention into the news and digital media. The reason is itself the title of the book and the nature of the book. I must congratulate all authors of this book. The book explains Sabah's 2020 election was Malaysia's first pandemic election. While attention centers on the election's impact on the spread of COVID-19, this collection brings together scholars, journalists, and social activists who were on the ground in Sabah to analyze what actually happened, why, and the broader implications of the outcome for Sabah and Malaysian politics. The book is the first in-depth study of a Sabah election. It is a multidisciplinary with authors from different perspectives and the majority of authors from Sabah. The traditional explanations prioritize the role of federal-state government relationship in shaping Sabah politics. Sabah from the Ground challenges this paradigm, suggesting that politics in Sabah needs to be better understood as a reflection of conditions with Sabah as Sabahans struggle to navigate and survive on Malaysia's periphery. I would allow the session today to explain how 2020 Sabah elections occurred during the fragile political environment in Malaysia and Sabah, how the election saw a record number of candidates running for the seats, very interesting, as could have an impact on the federal government. All authors in this book were on the ground during elections and wrote their chapters from various perspectives. These perspectives include political complaining, the election results, the experience of different Sabah communities, important issues such as unemployment and the Malaysian Agreement 1963, and the impact of civil society organizations. Let us together explore more about the book today in this following session. With this, thank you so much, and I wish everyone all the best. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin.
All right, thank you very much for that, Prof. Kashif. For our next speaker, I first like to introduce the next speaker, which will be our first to provide introductory remarks. It will be Professor Datuk Dr. Danny Wong from the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, University of Malaya. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. Very good morning. Yang berbahagia, Professor Dr. Kashif Hussain, Head of School of Media and Communication, Taylor's University. Yang berbahagia, Professor Madya Dr. Ramzah Dambul, Deputy Vice Chancellor, University Malaysia Sabah. Our special guest, Datuk Seri Panglima, Dr. Muhammad Salleh Keruak, who is our former Chief Minister, editors of the book, and all the contributors to the volume, colleagues, students, and friends. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you greetings from the University of Malaya. First of all, I'd like to thank Prof. Kashif for the kind invite to speak at today's Sabah from the Ground discussion. Now, I would like to, first of all, congratulate the editors, Bridget, who is an old friend, Benjamin, a new acquaintance, and Vilashini, a young colleague of mine, for having worked in bringing together a distinguished group of scholars, of academics, activists, political analysts, lawyers, and graduate students, as well as the media folks, to contribute to the volume. Now, it is never an easy task to coordinate a book project that involves so many people and to bring it out so quickly and fast. And it is published by the reputable publisher SIRD, Gerak Budaya, and ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore. I call it quick and fast because the impetus that sparked the fire for the book came as an attempt to look into the recent 2020 Sabah state election. Many of us, me included, were back in Sabah for the election. Now, in my case, I didn't do observation, I didn't do any study, but I just had a very simple role of to cast my vote and to visit my parents and to do some work at the state archives. So for me and my wife, however, what we remember best about this trip were, there were two things. One, the constant discussion on who to vote for. Who should I cast my vote for? Now, secondly, was the sudden rise in the number of COVID-19 cases in the state. Many people said it's because of the campaigning and so on. Now, so much so that on the way back, we had to undergo swab test, and then we were quarantined for 14 days. So I was welcoming my new students to the new session online instead of being physically present. Of course, we all came away from that election knowing that there was a change in government, and also there was a new chief minister. Now, perhaps going back briefly on the question on who to vote for. This is, of course, a very usual, if not perennial, issue whenever there is an election. But the 2020 Sabah state election should be no different in that regard. But somehow this time, when one looked carefully, the lines that were drawn were not as clear as many of the earlier state elections. It was challenging for many to decide on whom should they cast their votes for, who should their support go to. My parents and my in-law, who are in their 80s, for instance, were asking who should they vote for? Was it for Warisan Plus, or was it for the Gabungan Rakyat Sabah? This was perhaps contributed by the relatively, I would say, short time or short period of time that Warisan Plus was in government, which they tried to promise a lot, tried to do a lot. And the manner of the two groups of political parties that were grouped together, the way they were configured or forged, somehow confused many to the point of not having a clear battle line as before. It is also barely 8 months since the conclusion of the elections. So for historian like me, we will say that the period is far too short for the dust has not settled for us to draw meaningful conclusion. But the book is not a historical book, and the book is now out. And the purpose of us gathering this morning is to discuss about the book and perhaps also to launch the book. Having had the benefit of a quick glance on the book and also some detailed reading of some part of it, I realized that the book and all the chapters in it are solid work, very solid work. Each of the chapters addresses one or two of the issues of the period leading up to the elections campaign, and of course its aftermath and its effect on the people of the state as an entity as well as the nation. How different was the 2020 edition from the previous Sabah state elections? And what do I think of the book? Now, please allow me to offer two brief points, one on the election and also one on the book. Now, for me, the 2020 Sabah state election is probably one of the most closely contested elections to mind. The battle lines were shifting constantly. There's the confusion that I alluded to just now. While not directly linked to the national politics, in many ways, the pattern to which the political allegiance or alliances were forged could very well be the precursor to the coming national elections. My old friend, Philip Golingai, we were classmates, raised a very interesting point. Philip's chapter talks about Keruak politics, the politics of ganging up against someone, or being Keruak as being ganged up against. While Philip detected this in the recent elections and explained this via this very interesting Kadazan word of Keruak, I do wonder if the use of this word, the development of Keruak politics, ganging up, could also see some parallel development at the national level. And I think in the same way, many of the issues that were raised by the different authors also in many ways would be reflected at the national politics as well. Now, the book is organized in such manner that the chapters were grouped into sections, namely context, narratives, campaigning, and results. It is very easy to follow, almost like a historical piece of work, chronological approach. But what struck me was about the book is the ease, the way that the writers put out many issues confronting Sabah and its people into the open and in academic writing. So many of the issues that we heard in an open forum, but now has been cast in writing in a properly published book, academic book. Now, the issue of MA 63, the illegal immigrants, the PTI issue, unemployment, youth issues, youth bills, mixed marriages, and also issues pertaining to civil society, security, social security, and developmental issues, all discussed in the most open manner, yet in-depth research were done on them. In the analysis of the results, the book then offers a pattern of votes based on the various major ethnic groups. So we get to see Oyai-san and his colleague offering a chapter on the Chinese in Sabah, something that I used to do in the past, Kadazan Dusun, and also the Muslim voters, how they voted and things like that. And many of the chapters were written after much thought and research, and they offer in-depth analysis that few could replicate. The Iduan talks about the aftermath event of comparing the manner Warisan government and the GRS government dealing with the COVID-19 pandemics. That's in the conclusion chapter. Now, perhaps it's interesting to ask why there is a need to rethink about Sabah, which is the theme set for today's session. This is the theme, very interesting. One could imagine that the need to do so if something is not right, and therefore need to rethink about something, or something, in this case, is Sabah not on the right track? The book raises many questions, and some of the authors also attempted to provide some answers to these questions. Many of these questions are as old as since Sabah came into Malaysia in 1963. Issues on unemployment. I remember reading about those days not having enough people coming to work. In fact, there were enough jobs those days, but today we are talking about unemployment and developmental issues. Why, for instance, we are still having areas that have no dedicated water and electrical supplies. Why is the education achievements among rural folks remain very low? Well, these two were not exactly discussed in the book per se, but then coming from me as a Sabahan who constantly confronting these kind of issues or confronted with these kind of issues, and why is the PTI issue remain reversed for so many years? And in my case, probably throughout my entire life, actually. So in closing, contrary to my claim that the dust had not settled, or at least to a historian like me, I would like to quote Chan Su Chong in chapter 2 that I quote, "The dust has settled for now, but Malaysia is still in the midst of political uncertainties, of new trajectories and configurations." It was, of course, referring to the future role of warisan, including in the national politics. Yet I'm glad to say that with the publishing of Sabah from the ground, the study of elections in Malaysia have perhaps went out by several notches. I think the editors and all the writers deserve our thanks and also congratulations for setting such a high standard for future research and writings on elections in Malaysia. And knowing Bridget and friends, I look forward with great anticipation for an even better book when Malaysia goes to the next post. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Prof. Danny, for those lovely, kind words. We are very, very happy to hear that. Okay, so moving on, let me just introduce our next speaker, which is going to be Associate Professor T.S. Dr. Ramzah Dambul, who is currently the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation for the University of Malaysia, Sabah. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning, everyone. Is that clear? I hope that can you hear me, Dr. Ben?
Yes, can hear you perfectly fine.
Okay. Yang berhormat Datuk Seri Panglima Dr. Salleh Keruak. We are very honored to have you as the guest speaker in this event, Datuk Seri. My best friend and my fellow alumni yang berbahagia, Professor Datuk Dr. Wong. Nice to meet you here, sir. Professor Dr. Kashif Hussain, Head of School of Media and Communication, Faculty of Social Sciences and Leisure Management, Taylor University. All the authors of the book who are also going to share some insight on the book later. First of all, I would like to extend my appreciation to Taylor University for inviting UMS to be the co-host for the launching of this very, very interesting book. And also thank you for allowing me to say a few words before we start with the real discourse or the real deal. I have to be honest that I haven't had the opportunity to read the book. However, Dr. Trixie, one of the authors, has shared with me a quite comprehensive review of the entire content of the book. So my so-called remark this morning will be based on this. If it is not accurate, then we can blame on Dr. Trixie. Personally, I think this book is very special because of the diverse backgrounds of the authors. We have scholars, journalists, and social activists. So what we captured on the ground is enriched by these many different perspectives. This book has covered all the issue related to the main narrative of Sabah politics, I think, like the long-standing illegal immigrant issues, the power struggle between state and federal issues on poverty and development, religion, ethnicity, the influences of the media, the young emerging generation, young voters, and almost everything. And the main aim of the book is obviously trying to make sense what happened in the last state election, 2020, trying to connect all the dots and identify and explain the element that influence the voting behavior and eventually produce the outcome that we all, by now, we all know it already. But of course, this is not an easy task. My research area is climate change, and it is a very complex and unpredictable, keep changing over time and space. But I think when we are talking about politics, it is even more dynamic and complicated. There are many interesting insights given in this book, I'm sure, to explain the main drivers for the voting behaviors. But each one of the analysis is focused on a very specific context and most probably doesn't really apply in all the other contexts. This book is the view of Sabah on the ground. I would like to share the view from the above the ground or the big picture, just to see the synergy of these two views. Dr. Ben, can you share the figure now?
All right, it's shared.
Actually, this is the finding from research conducted by Majlis Professor Negara, the National Professor Council in 2015. I know that was like 6 years ago, but I think it is still relevant because it was tested again few other times, including the last year's election. I mean, before the election, even though it is tested not throughout Sabah, only few done, but I think that is good enough just to, to see the main patterns remain more or less the same. What I'm trying to say is what I'm trying to show here is actually there is a good link between what was observed on the ground, which is expressed in this book, and what was established based on the view above the ground. I'm referring to this finding by the Majlis Professor Negara. Look at the table. Okay. It actually showed the 5 significant patterns for voting behavior in Sabah. And this is established by a psychometric test using a principal component analysis of very robust statistical analysis based on more than 1,200 respondents all over Sabah. And the survey has more than 50 items. So look at the table there. I'll just trying to explain what is the meaning behind that statistic. So there are 5 types of significant voters in Sabah, meaning that we have these 5 types of voters, and each one of that type they have their own motivation of how they are going to vote. The first one is issue centric. Meaning that they are voting based on issues. They are really the most politically literate voters because they really dig into each issue before making their decision. And that is 80% of the voters. The second one is leader-centric. Leader-centric, they are voting based on who the candidates are, 8%. Meaning that they don't care about issue, but they are just looking at the candidates. And the third one is party-centric, voting based on which party the candidate comes from, and that is 5 point, well, we can probably we can put it like 6%. And then the fourth one is those who are voting based on what they capture, based on what the info that they get from mainstream traditional media, television, press, and probably radio, and that is 6.4%. And the final one is the new media-centric, meaning that they are voting based on info they get from alternative media, especially social media. And that is almost 5%. Now, there are two main points that we must understand from this finding. The first one is the percentage of each behavior will vary depending on the context and areas. This is for Sabah overall. What we get from that research is Sabah for overall. The proportion may be different in certain districts, certain zone, or certain parliamentary. For example, there might be more leader-centric voters in Sempurna and Kinabatangan. I mean, this is just example, Whereas in the urban area, in the West Coast, probably they have more issue-centric voters, probably much more than 18%. So it will be vary. But overall, when we we just add everything and then we get that statistic, the main statistic just now. The second one is these 5 patterns are the significant identified voting behavior, which only account for 43%, meaning that that is 43%, right? Meaning that there are 57 random voters who are voting based on other reason that we cannot identify as a pattern because there are just too many and a very small number of voters assigned to each one of that characteristic. Before the state election 2020, the belief was, we have this belief that this election would be the do and die for the federal government, Perikatan Nasional. What will happen in this election would significantly provide an indication of the outcome for the coming general election at the national level. I mean, that is the belief, but seriously, I don't think that that is the case. Okay, let's just put it hypothetically, based on that data from the Majlis Profesor Negara, Let's just put it hypothetically. Let's say there will be one party which is extremely effective, dominating the narrative on the issues, putting a super excellent strategy on the party and leadership, and able to find a very good tune with the traditional and alternative media, meaning that the captive voters are only 43%. Even if you do that perfect, everything is perfect, you still have to face the 57 unpredictable voters. So basically my point is Sabah politics and Malaysia in general is becoming more and more unpredictable. No politician or parties can claim that they have the advantage because the majority of the voters actually would vote based on reason that nobody can predict. I mean, we cannot identify the patterns. The most that we can do is the 43% just now that, that 5 types. So nobody can efficiently control the narrative or put a good effective strategy on how to capture them all. From my limited understanding of the books, from the review given by Dr. Trixie, I think this is the sentiment expressed by the authors in that book, because different authors looking at different angles and factors in arguing their case, which is valid for that chosen context. But probably you cannot just transfer the same formula to other contexts and expecting the same outcome. So with that, thank you, and I wish everyone a productive discussion. Thank you so much. Back to you, Dr. Ben.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Ram, for those very, very interesting contrasting views of what we had presented in the book. I'm sure the authors will have some very interesting things to sort of like say to that later on today. All right, so moving on, I'd like to sort of introduce our special guest speaker for today. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. I'd like to invite Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Panglima, Dr. Salleh Syed Keruak, who is currently the State Representative for Sukan and a former Chief Minister of Sabah.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. Good morning to everyone and salam kenal. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for including me in this discussion as a special guest presenter. Secondly, I want to put on record my thanks to Professor Bridget for inviting me as to give forward in her book, together with Tan Sri Bernard Dompok. I don't know why she chooses me, even though I'm a practicing politician, but I think Dr. Bridget knows me very well, that I can be very independent in my political views. I've read the book, I have the opportunity to read the book, and I think that it's well researched and very factual. And I think certainly it will contribute immensely to political literature of Sabah politics from various perspectives. The contributors are from academicians, activists, and journalists. And they look at things from different angles. So when Dr. Bridget asked me to give the forward in her book, I was thinking what angle I should take. Then I've decided to put some observations. Normally then when we talk about Malaysia, they always ask Sabahan to learn from Kuala Lumpur, from Semenanjung. When talk about economic development, we always say that Kuala Lumpur or KL or Semenanjung much better than us. You look at the KD&K, the growth, 2018, Semenanjung, Malaysia 4.7%, Sabah only 1.5%. 2019, Semenanjung 4.5%, Sabah only 0.5%. But maybe this is debatable, right? As far as economic is concerned. But I'm talking about political development. When you talk about political development, I think Sabah is much better. We embrace political change much earlier than Semenanjung. If you observe the political history of Sabah, there are 5 peaceful transitions from one government to another government. You exclude changes of chief minister during the rotation system. I'm just saying transition, peaceful transition from one government to another government 5 times. It was smooth indeed, even though there is hiccups here and there, some problems here and there. But overall, there is no prolonged political crisis. Because Sabahan, after election, they are united together and move on. It doesn't mean they agree with the government, but they always cooperate with the government and give opportunity for the government to function effectively. Why is this so? So if you have to understand the political development in Sabah, you must look at the political history and the political culture of Sabah. So to understand the election results of 2020, you must go back to the history of Sabah. I'm using the first principle thinking, which was initiated by Aristotle to analyze the whole thing. You see, when we fight for independence at that time, we want to make sure that we free ourselves from colony, not to another colony. That's the principle. There are 3 things we want to make sure happen in Sabah. Number 1, there must be political development. We subscribe to political development. We want good infrastructure, we want jobs, we want opportunities, we want education infrastructure for Sabah. Number 2, we want what they call it politics of accommodation, politics of moderations. We want to accommodate everybody. We are not like Semenanjung. The concept of Ketuanan Melayu was there when they gained independence. But in Sabah, we want to work together among the races, the Bumi Putra, Muslim, non-Muslim, and non-Bumi Putra, to work together to accommodate, to share the power at that time. So that is a principle. And number 3, what they call it, politics of autonomy. Everybody is fighting for Sabah, political autonomy. So these 3 aspects of politics was imbued since early political development of Sabah. So in Sabah, when they cooperate, it doesn't mean they agree. If they don't like the party in power, at that time they stylize tukar baju. They just change it. They don't care. So they observe what's happening, whether the government is still subscribing to the 3 aspects of politics: politics of development, politics of accommodations, and politics of autonomy. So these are the basic, to me, principles that Sabahans hold to. So if you look at the history of Sabah politics, this is something Semenanjung must learn from us. Because the way we handle things, that we realize that there are differences among us. When we fight to win election, we already fight to win election. But when after election, we are back together. We manage our differences. We celebrate our differences. This is different. Number two, my observation is that when we talk about voting trend, I think Dr. Ram has mentioned just now, we don't vote just simply because of ethnicity or because of rural-urban divide. We vote because of various aspects. If you look at the political theory, people vote because of three things. Number one, they vote because of party. If I want to drink cola, you serve me Pepsi, I will go for cola. I don't care whether Pepsi is better than cola, but I go for cola. I vote based on party. Number two, I vote based on issues. Maybe development, maybe candidate, whatever it is, based on issues. Number three, you vote because of environment, political environment. Look at the social media, what's happening. You are aware of issues, then you decide based on the political environment at that time. So Sabah, this happened, If in Semenanjung, the trend is quite clear. The Malays will vote for Malay-based party, like UMNO, PAS, or any other Malay political parties. The Chinese may go for DAP, they go for Emcee, Gerakan, or any other parties. So as the Indians. But in Sabah, it doesn't happen. Because we believe that, we hold to the belief that the power is with us. That's why, if we don't like it, we just change the government. Tukar baju. That's the istilah, tukar baju. So if you look at the history of Sabah, you look at since independence. When at that time, when we go for independence, there's a proper arrangement between us, between the Bumiputra Muslim, non-Bumiputra Muslim, and the non-Bumiputra. In fact, this istilah Bumiputra Muslim and non-Muslim because of the creations of political parties, where the parties are based on ethnicity. But as far as Sabah is concerned, they're together. They fight for independence. They want to move Sabah out from a colonial power. They want freedom. They want opportunities. This is the basic principles. They practice politics of accommodation. We have to accommodate. So when you look at independence at the time in the 60s, everything is well arranged, well accommodated. But in Semenanjung is different. When they go for independence, they're talking about Ketuanan Melayu at that time. But Sabah, there's no such thing as Ketuanan Melayu. That's why here, we're more than 30 ethnic groups. We can work together, even though there are political differences among us. The other one very interesting for me to observe regarding the young voters, the role of young voters, social media, and also civil society. These are the key for the future. When we talk about democracy at work, you must take into account these three things: the young voters, social media, and also the civil society. So it was written in this book. I think this is the future, but whatever it is, they still tie up to three aspects of politics, Sabah and Holt: the politics of development, politics of accommodations, number three, politics of autonomy. When we fight for Sabahans, issues like MA63, like the PTI, we should depoliticize the whole thing. Because it doesn't belong to any political party. It belongs to Sabahan. Whether you're young or generation, everyone's autonomy for Sabah, fighting for Sabah rights. So this must be across the board. It doesn't belong to any political party, but everybody must fight for autonomy of Sabah. So any party, political party, any candidate who are not subscribing to this kind of three basic principles, they are out of the game. So basically, this is my observation, and I think if you read many articles in this book, they cover so many subjects, but you can't run away. When you analyze any political happening in Sabah, you must look at the political history and political culture in Sabah. Then from there, you can move on and you can have proper analysis to read what happened to the future. So my opinion that if you study deeper on the young generations, on the basic principles of our understanding in political arrangement in Sabah, this will be the key for future politics. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that, YB. Salleh, we really are very very nice to hear those kind words from you. And I think we are very, very hopeful that we can actually learn a lot of things coming out from this book. And we hope that this book actually does sort of spur a discussion of sort of like a more mature discussion about how politics can move forward in Malaysia. Okay, so I'd like to thank you so much to all our speakers for your kind words and important food for thought that we are going to keep in mind when we go into the next part of the session for today. We really appreciate you spending time to join us today, and we are very, very grateful for your support. And we really hope that you really have more time to sort of go through our book after this. Okay, so that goes to the end of the introductory section of today's session. Next, I'd like to introduce my fellow co-editor, Dr. Vilashini Somya from the University of Malaya, to now conduct the second section of the session, which is going to be a panel presentation with all the authors from the book. So she will be the moderator for today, and I'd now like to pass the floor to her.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben. Hi, everybody. Kopi Vosian. Selamat pagi. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very happy to see so many people. I echo Dr. Ben's, feeling of absolute gratitude to not just our writers, but to also UMS, Taylor's University, and the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, for really hosting this and elevating the conversation to a much more academic one. We're very excited, and we think there's so much to discuss. So going into the next session, I would like to introduce to all of us, we had 24 spectacular writers in this book, but we have 6 today to really sort of unpack their work. They're going to share with us within, 5 minutes or so about their respective piece. We're going to start today with my friend, Tony Paridi Bagang from UITM Sabah. Tony, are you there?
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. The floor is yours, my friend, for 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Villa. Thank you to the organizers. I'm very honored to be invited to share what we have done in this book together with my co-author, Dr. Arnold, and my supervisors. And it's very interesting. In fact, when I read some of the chapters, I also got so excited to read something that is, I think, giving us a different narrative. Yeah. So I would like to share what about my chapters. One more chapter on the Kadazan Dusun politics. So basically, this topic we have chosen based on not only the PRN Sabah election, but we have also observed in the previous election. In fact, I was so interested when I transferred or moved to Sabah way back in 2007 and started to follow the elections, electoral politics in Sabah in particular. So when looking at that perspective, and I see that there is a very unique of this Kadazan Dusun politics, and of course, being as a Kadazan, Tatana ethnic from Kuala Penyu, and I feel like I need to understand the dynamism of our people, our communities. So okay, our topic is basically on this touching on the persistence of this personality politics, patronage, as well as ethno-nationalism. So as you know that the Kadazan play a significant role in the development of Sabah politics. If you were to refer to the previous election results, you can see the trend similar, except if you back to the history 1985 and so on, and before that. So in the G14, in the G14, when we look at the result of the elections, in zooming into the Kadazan Dusun, we've seen that there is not much change in terms of their voting patterns. Yeah? But of course, the Warisan was able to break up, in terms of the UMNO dominance in the Muslim Bumi Putra. Whereas for the Kadazan Dusun, it didn't. It didn't change that much, and in fact, it managed to gain at least more than 40% in terms of its popular votes. Yeah. Now, in the PRN 20, the state elections recently, GRS won mostly of the Kadazan Dusun seats, while only few seats won by Warisan Plus. So we are trying to unpack some of these questions. Was Warisan able to pull through in the Kadazan Dusun constituencies in terms of to get the support from the electorates, Kadazan Dusun electorates? Did Warisan manage to win the support and mobilize them? What are the factors that determine the voting behaviors of the Kadazan Dusun? So these are among the things that we researched. And our analysis was basically based on our own observation. We went through all the way to Keningau, to Suk, Nabawan, and Motunggong, Tambunan, and all of this, which we considered of a very competitive Kadazan Dusun constituencies. And, like I've taken, for example, like in Kulu, where you can see this, the key figures of the Kadazan Dusun leaders competing between Madius Tangau and Janiston from PBS, and also in Tambunan, Jeffrey Kitingan. So what we have found from our analysis, we argue that the voting patterns, the voting of the Kadazan Dusun area is influenced by the politics of personality, which in fact mentioned by our guest speakers just now. Patronage, and here in the context of Kadazan Dusun, the ethno-nationalism still play a very significant factors in shaping the voting patterns of the Kadazan Dusun. So it also linked with the leaders' contributions in the societies, especially when they are holding special roles. For example, if you look at the Huguan Sio, Tan Sri Pairan, who so happened to the Huguan Sio, and he used to be the president of PBS, he managed to retain that support. He able to appeal as well as to mobilize support for PBS and GRS as well. And at the same time, the Kitingan factors, the Kitingan factors, which we also examine, still a very influential among the Kadazan Dusun, especially in the interior. If you go to Tambunan, if you go to Petsiangan, they still are talking about these names, and they are so it is so close to their hearts. So if compared to other parties, there are no similar personalities to the Kitingan brothers in Warisan, for example, and this actually gave the sort of a disadvantage to the Warisan plus. So what else that actually contribute to the voting patterns of the Kadazan Dusun? Of course, when we talk about the patronage politics, the patronage politics, that it sees that those people, especially those electorates, especially in the interior, they look at GRS, so which is associated with the Perikatan Nasional, that is able to give much better in terms of monetary assistance, as well as when we talk about developmentalism, as compared to the Warisan Plus government. And the issues that being played up actually raise the sentiment of this ethno-nationalism. For example, these are another factors that where they accuse, saying that Warisan Party is something is related to illegal immigrant and pro-illegal, and playing up this ethnic sentiment, yeah, the identities of the leaders. Yeah, so these are among the things that we have discussed in our book and in our chapters. And what is the moving forward? Yeah, from reading from our chapters.
30 seconds, Tony. 30
All right,
seconds.
this is the time. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is the time that when the Kadazan should look beyond of this all politics, which is driven by personalities, patronage, and identity politics. And having said that, of course, we need a greater political awareness as well as a political literacy among the youngsters, so that this can be the point of departures to embrace for a new political cultures. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was so lovely, wonderfully put. Thank you so much for that. And yes, KDM politics is in fact incredibly important in the scheme of what we discuss in the book. But moving along, I'm going to pass the mic over to my co-writer, somebody I would call an ally and a friend of Sabah politics, Aslam Jalil, who is representing, he is a fellow of the University Malaya, but is currently in the midst of almost completing his PhD at University of Queensland. Aslam?
Hello everyone, thank you Vila for co-writing with me this chapter and for guiding me about Sabah politics. So our chapter is entitled Incessant Political Narratives, Perilous Migrants and the Treacherous East. Basically, we actually unpack the debate, the dinosaur issue of irregular migrants living in Sabah. As we all know that close to 30% of population in Sabah actually comprises of migrants, either documented or undocumented. So we actually did our multi-sited ethnography in Kota Kinabalu area as well as Semporna districts during the election, and we gathered some perspectives from the locals as well as referring to journals and the political discourse that has been happening about Sabah politics. So what this chapter does is that it unpacks why and how a xenophobic discourse continues to exist in Sabah by taking into considerations the socio-political divisions between the east and west coast of Sabah. So basically, as we all know, the irregular migration issue in Sabah, has been there for many decades. And there are different categories of migrants living in Sabah. Mostly, the refugees coming from the Philippines. We also have migrants from the Philippines and Indonesia as well. And when we talk about these irregular migrants, they're not necessarily newly arrived migrants, because some of them have been living in Sabah for a few generations. So we are also talking about local Sabahans. But what happens in Sabah election recently was that the distrust and the suspicion, especially those in the on the west coast towards people on the east coast, because ethnically, culturally, these people, Bajau and Suluk, for example, they have similar traditions and cultural heritage with those in the Philippines. So therefore, it is easier for some people to make allegation that somehow the irregular migrants actually have been infiltrated into these Bajau and Suluk communities, and trying to erode the political power of the indigenous people, who are mostly Christians. For example, the Kadazan Murut community. So there's also the debate about indigeneity and also foreign. So this chapter actually will make us think about who can be considered as indigenous, who can be considered as foreign, because as far as we're concerned, these irregular migrants have been in Sabah for a few generations. So are they still not indigenous? So that is something that the readers can ponder by reading this chapter. So what happened during the last election was the anti-migrant sentiment, being amplified towards the East Coast people. Parti Warisan Sabah, for example, was accused of breeding like PTI or illegal migrants by the opponent. To the fact that Shafi Abdal was also accused of not coming from Sabah. So again, there's an issue about indigeneity and being foreign being raised during this election. So unfortunately, the anti-migrant sentiment actually was amplified, through various platforms, especially the digital platform like WhatsApp, YouTube, on social media like Facebook. However, there's like some daring campaign so blatant about being against PTI, for example, a
1 minute
billboard.
left, Aslam.
Okay, a billboard saying Sabah free of PTI. And we also need to remind ourselves that this issue is not something new. It's not that during Warisan there's like zero PTI, or during Barisan National, they actually were responsible for PTI. This has been it's a long issue, and therefore we can't simply blame one side or the other side. What we need to do is for both parties to work together to actually solve this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Aslam. I would like to remind everybody who's watching today that we are open to questions right at the end of what our speakers, after our speakers have spoken. So, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat box and we will definitely get to it later. Yeah, I'm going to hand the mic back to also my co-editor, but also a writer in this book, Dr. Benjamin Loh.
Right, thank you very much for that, Dr. Villa. Okay, so I co-wrote a chapter in this book. Essentially, my chapter is entitled Don't Jump, Time to Work, Political Maturity of Sabah Digital Spaces Through the 2020 State Election. So I co-wrote this with my fellow contributor who unfortunately could not attend here today, which is Ho Yu Jian from Sunway University. And essentially, our chapter is really sort of looking at how we examined the digital spaces of Facebook to see how posts and comments were done during the Sabah 2020 election campaign period. So what we had done essentially is that we looked into various Facebook groups over the course of this campaign period, and we sort of just did a discourse analysis to see what was the kinds of discussions that took place and how this could inform us, or we could see how campaigning was done in the digital space. And we decided to do this because this was a very unique opportunity to just sort of study this sort of digital campaigning being done purely in the state of Sabah, because usually Sabah elections are done together with the general election. So this was a very, very unique opportunity that was given here in that sense. And so the chapter covers quite a bit of a lot of aspects, but I just wanted to sort of bring up some of the main takeaways here. And these takeaways are very, very interesting because they sort of like contrary to a lot of the other chapters in our book, this has actually a lot more positive outlook by the end of it. So first off, the main takeaways is that like many other digital social media spaces that we have in Malaysia, there are of course a lot of cyber troopers, which are what we call politically motivated actors that are either paid or funded by political parties. And then we also have groups of people called machais, or it's a colloquial term to refer to people who are diehard fans of a particular political party. So they're not necessarily paid or they are part of that party, but they are very, very they are very ardent supporters of the political party that they support. And the role these groups often have within these online discussions is that they create a sort of spiral of silence or echo chamber effect that amplifies minority voices and also suppresses majority voices in that sense. And by the end of it, the end effect is that it distorts the perception of public opinion or support. So what we examined is that there is indeed cyber trooper or machai activity happening on both sides of the political divide. Those that are focusing on GRS tended to highlight the failing economy and lack of meaningful development based on Warisan's short 26 months tenure, and they often try to reinforce the whole PTI Warisan Association as that is very similar to what Aslam mentioned right before, because that was seen as the main force that ruined the Kimanis by-election for Warisan earlier in the year. And for Warisan, the main narrative push for them was to highlight all the corruption and the lack of development during the years under the BN administration. They commonly use terms like thieves and robbers or perompak and penyamun to sort of paint the other side, essentially. We also found a very, very interesting case whereby we see a lot of peninsula-based cyber troopers who try to infiltrate these spaces, but due to the fact that they are not familiar with Sabah lingo and dialects, are easily spotted by native Sabahans, who then are able to sort of deflect from them and ignore whatever comments they make, and subtly reinforces their belief that they are actually engaging with true Sabahans in these spaces after that. And what was very, very interesting is that unlike in the peninsula spaces, commenters here regularly engage with people from opposing views. They don't, even though they may not accept all of their views. And one thing to be mindful of is that we as authors were very, very wanted to really forefront all this and indicate that this digital space was mainly comprised of urban or Kota Kinabalu-centric Sabahans who engage. And we are not trying to represent that this is representative of Sabah as a whole. But overall, one of the big takeaways that we got, which is where the title of our chapter came about, was that after the campaign period ended, many Sabahan commenters were very, very quick to attack any sort of politically charged posts that were aimed to divert attention away from pressing issues that were facing Sabah in the aftermath of the election. So for those of you who may not remember, that was around the time the second wave of COVID-19 infections came about, and there was also massive flooding that took place in Sabah just a few days after the election. And this was when commenters quite unilaterally agreed that the new government of GRS needed to be given a chance to prove themselves in government. They also were very quick to caution Warisan to just accept the loss, because there was a lot of arguments going around that caused a lot of uncertainty on the ground, and just focus on being a good opposition. And finally, everybody sort of agreed that the current state government should actually just get to working on solving the state's problems and stop pushing the blame to the former government. And we saw this as a very, very refreshing view of Sabah, and what we call political maturity, where people are able to set aside their political differences once an election is over and give the newly elected government a chance to prove themselves. And my hope for the future, just to end this, is that we hope that this can be emulated in federal politics, because over in the peninsula side of Malaysia, cyber trooper and macha interference has really poisoned these digital public sphere discourses as well. And so the idea behind it is that this contributes to my idea of trying to fix the digital public sphere of Malaysia, to reduce the impact of cyber troopers and machais on political discourse. And I believe that this would be a very, very important lesson for all Malaysians, that we should be more open or receptive to views and perspectives that are in opposition to our own, and hopefully promote healthy discourse and break down barriers and divisions between the various peoples of Malaysia. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass it back to Dr. Villa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin. I'm moving along. Dr. Trixie, a representative from UMS, who wrote a very interesting topic about youth. Maybe share with us what you wrote and how this really impacts the way we rethink about Sabah.
Thank you, Villa. Thank you very much. I am so happy to have joined this project. When Bridget called me late last year, and said, you know, anthropologists have to read the political ground too in Sabah. And I hesitated just a bit, because I've been away for so many years, and I thought, you know, maybe this is a chance for me to really find out how the youth are going to respond, especially finding out that very soon youth at age 18 will be able to take part in voting. So I have basically 2 points of sharing from my chapter called Sabah Youth Talk Politics. But just to preface, I spoke to 7 youth from various parts of Sabah, And they were able to reflect on the way that they had voted. Surely they talked to me before the voting as well, a little bit guarded, didn't tell me who they would vote. But after the voting process, they were more inclined to speak. So the two things that I learned from this youth is that firstly, you know, Sabahans are masters of the universe, and Sabahan youth are definitely mastering that universe. And we should not discount their political savvy in this time, because they are young in terms of age, but not politically so. They have gathered wisdom along their, their youth, and by observing very keenly what elders are doing, what's happening in the community, what's happening on the ground. For example, you know, eating together, going somewhere, are chances for them to find out just what people are thinking and whom they see as favorable in competitions like an election. But most of the benign things that happen in everyday Sabahan culture that we take for granted in Sabah may be right places, rich environments for them to harness their points of view again. Cockfighting was an example that they mentioned. Sabong ayam, for those who know this in Malay. It's an illegal activity, and it was a chance for them to talk about why should they choose a politician who was involved in such an underground activity. Whereas this is, you know, part and parcel of the Sabahan culture. So that was one way they could sort of arrange their position and join in the narrative and give voice to that kind of discourse, political discourse around them. Another example was noting how so and so in the community is now quite materially well off. They could sort of switch their old pickup truck or their older version to a higher, better running model. In Sabah, we nicknamed any four-wheel drive as Hilux. Anything could be a Hilux. But those sort of very keen auditing with their eyes in the community is something that, you know, you can't teach them. They just spot these things and they know, and they keep in their repertoire of knowledge. And as they go along in gathering political sentiment, obviously, they will then, you know, go back to that points of reference in your mind. So they are definitely wise beyond their years. And I think they give a lot of weight in this election, definitely in the past one and in the future. So the second thing I'd like to point out is that when we talked about choice issues, right, and there were several issues that came about. Obviously, the intractable situation, what we call PTI or PATI in Sabah, and the other more issue that we don't normally explore, but we always talk about as Sabahans, which is religious freedom or freedom of religion. Interestingly, when these two issues were put side by side, most of my informants, if not all of them, would then go into preferring the first over the second one, which is I would rather, you know, have PTI in Sabah than lose that freedom to embrace my religion without question. And this comes to the fact of Sabahans are typically quite harangued or tired of being seen as something other than what they profess or their faith. And I talk about my Muslim participants who feel that they should not be questioned for their faith by outsiders. They are just who they are. In Sabah context, it's the camaraderie, the true camaraderie that has everyone take everyone else at face value, because the camaraderie that is bought by intermarriage and openness to each other's practices, religious and cultural and traditional practices, including, has cemented that in the bedrock of the society. So that is the more choice issue on the table for our youth, from my point of view, and certainly from the chapter you could read that. And it would be something in the future for anyone to read and discuss this further, and certainly for politicians, that if you want to keep talking to youth, you have to do it at a very sincere and deep level. because they know what they want. So I think that's all from me. And
Thanks so much, Trixie.
Yeah, from politics of accommodation, we don't go into politics of disillusionment for the youth. Thank you very much.
That's beautifully put. Thank you so much, Dr. Trixie Tangit, everybody. I go from Dr. Trixie Tangit to another friend from UMS, Dr. James Alin. James, are you here with us? Hi, James. You're muted, yeah? Are you joining us from the field?
Yes, you can hear me now?
Loud and clear. Thank you very much, James. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Villa. I'm very happy reporting from the field. Yes, I am now on the foot of Kinabalu. I'm meeting the mountain guides of Kinabalu to discuss about the issue none other than unemployment among the mountain guides or the Malim Gunung. Okay. All right. So first of all, I'm very happy that this book is finally published. And I have a small, me and my co-author, Marcela, contributed a small chapter. And actually, I tried to read the other chapters because this is the first time we contributed to a book written by eminent political scientists, anthropologists, and many other scholars that are far from my own field, which is economics. So our chapter actually start with in the beginning when Borisan government took power, they set a target for them to settle the unemployment problem. Unemployment simply means too many people looking for a job, but not enough job for everyone. So at that time, they say they have a target in next 5 years, they will achieve that number. So we actually look at the data and compare their own performance. So that was a simple test, okay? So when Warisan government took power, Sabah economy was already an onset of recession. Recession is, how do we define recession? Recession is when your neighbors lose job, okay? They suddenly unemployed, okay? And so we towards the end of their administration in July 2020, so we actually come to conclusion they actually achieve about almost half of their objective of providing jobs. We also highlighted a reason why that target was not achieved, and certainly we calculated the cost of that unemployment. At the end of their administration, there was about 120,000 Sabahan unemployed person in Sabah, which is about one fourth of that unemployed person total in Malaysia. So. And among reason why they failed to achieve their target is, of course, I already said because they came to the wrong time. Economy was in the recession, but that doesn't mean they are innocent. Really, they could have done better. For example, they could, in terms of less making erratic and how to say harsh decision. So they made a lot of decision. For example, they decided to terminate contracts for water treatment plants. They imposed blanket ban on logs exports. And another is most controversial that caused a lot of jobs is they actually took the permit to run jackpots. Jackpots is a recreation. Okay, they what do you call? Yeah. So those other than the economy was not well. To make it worse was that Warisan government was not actually doing the right thing because they actually making things worse. So those contribute. That's why in the end of their administration, the number of unemployed person in Sabah increased maybe about 20 or 30,000 more. Okay. And when the new government took over, of course, they inherited because they took power half year.
1 minute left, James.
Okay, thank you. So when they took power, the new government GRS coalition, so they took power, so they inherited that unemployed person. So they how to move forward for them? What are lesson learned? First, possible they have to introduce a comprehensive package to solve jobless problem. Okay, first and foremost, they have to consider to speed up the vaccination program because we are in the mid of COVID pandemic, and 1.9 million workers in Sabah must be given priority so that they can go back to work, they can go out and let them be free to cross district. These are the people that actually eventually will also provide another job for people who is still unemployed, who lost job during the pandemic. So this is very clear, and the state government should not wait for federal government to send the vaccine. State government, their financial is strong, the budget, they are running budget surplus, very prudent, and they also have balance of payment surplus, means that we are selling things to the rest of the world more than we are buying. So we have enough resources to actually purchase our own vaccine. So one set of vaccine is 100 ringgit, which means if we have 1.9 million people to vaccinate, that means that that will cost around 190 million ringgit, which is very small amount. That's not even the same amount of the revenue collected by the BKK, the Kota Kinabalu city office. So will they do it or not? If they don't, then that means that our labor force will be affected and more people will be going to lose their job. At this very moment, business returning, but they are not back to normal. They are no longer like before. And many people are still suffering, looking for a job. So other
Thank you
than
very
that,
much. All right. Anyway,
yeah.
sorry, last 2 words, James.
Yes. So once again, I like to say thank you to the editors, Dr. Villa, Dr. Van, and Dr. Bridget, for putting a lot of hard work to make this book what it is. So I enjoy this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, and please stay safe in the field. Yeah. All right. So to end it all, I invite my very good friend, our really the guiding light for this entire project, Dr. Bridget Welsh, to really sort of close things up. She wrote 4 spectacular articles in this book, but you know, to sort of give us just the little crunch before we come to the end of this segment and go into a very short discussion session. Dr. Bridget.
Thanks very much for all of the organization that went into putting this event, Van and Villa, and for all of the colleagues to be part of the book, and to the guest speakers who've discussed these issues. I think I've written a number of chapters in the book, and I will leave you to read those. But I just want to make a few kind of observations about what this process has made us think about in terms of rethinking Sabah. So what we did in this book is that we intentionally made the research multidisciplinary. So in traditional analyses of elections, it's almost always political scientists. In this discussion, we brought in anthropologists, economists, social media experts, and others, because I think it's important to bring in and to look at topics collaboratively. It's not just that the people came from different backgrounds like journalism and activists, but also to think the different disciplines of the way they see these topics that I think are very important to understand. The second aspect I want to sort of highlight is that this book, in many ways, challenges the different narratives of ways of understanding Sabah politics. We lay out an argument about survival, but what it's doing is it's basically emphasizing that context, that interests, So Datuk Salleh earlier, Datuk Sri Salleh spoke about the issues of politics of accommodations, and talked about the different factors that are associated with why people vote. But what we were trying to put in this book by looking at things from the ground is to acknowledge the agency of Sabahans, the interest in the decisions that they make. And this is important because a lot of the research and the story and the history of elections and politics focuses on the story of the elites, but not ordinary Sabahans. And so a lot of the book deals with those issues in the way we rethink about Sabah, to bring in Sabahans as a whole in their complexity into the discussions. And in this regard, I think I'll just sort of emphasize one key point in one of my chapters, is that a lot of the research and analysis of politics in Malaysia focuses, or should we even say obsesses, on issues of ethnicity. And while we do have very important chapters, Tony talked about his and KDM this morning, and we have others in the book by Isan and Rahim Mustafa. But the fact is that ethnicity is not the only lens to begin to understand politics. And so when we look at voting behavior, which my chapter does look at from the top as well as from the bottom, looking at electoral behavior, what we see is that there are other things that become important, and such as where the income level, the class of people, the generational cohort they're living in, also the different issues of gender. And these types of cleavages and lenses are very important to understanding the complexities of a society like Sabah and its politics. And I think that if you know, earlier they talked about how Sabah is more of a melting pot compared to Peninsula Malaysia. But in this context, the research also has to incorporate more different things, that more of the spices that go into a curry, into the different flavors, to understand what is happening in places like Sabah. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That really summed things up beautifully. You know, and I have to say, everybody did such a wonderful job. An academic event like this is really here to sort of help us unpack, I guess, on an academic level, what it is that we're looking at and the kind of chapters, just a sample of the chapters that we have. I'd like to know whether there are any questions from our audiences right now. And the IT team would sort of share that with me in the chat. But as we wait for people to ask us questions, I'd like to direct some questions to some of our writers who may have gone a little earlier, and, you know, to sort of simultaneously get us to think about things that are happening outside of this book, outside of PRN 2020, moving forward in 2021. And, you know, you never know, in upcoming general elections to come in, say, what, 12 months, less, more, we don't know. So, you know, maybe I'd like to direct this question to Trixie, Tony, and James. So to begin with, you know, being Sabahans who do vote, for example, do you see, now that we've sort of come together and we've worked on this book and we are really unpacking this, you know, the minutiae and the nuances in Sabah, where do you see real changes taking effect in the communities that you've looked at? And if these changes would be, you know, would bring any sort of significant change, not just politically, but socially and economically? I'd just like a really short answer. Can we start with Trixie? Ladies first.
Okay, I believe that youths are organizing themselves already in various ways through NGOs and their own little think tanks, and, you know, their groups and friends and so on. So where in the future? I really like to see them even more visible than before. Is it too much to think that they'll form their own party? You never know. And I think some of them have it. So I could only imagine something like that might happen. That's from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trixie. Let's go to James in the field first. I'm very worried we might lose connection with you. Ada apa-apa mau tambah kah? I mean, in terms of where do you see these changes actually taking place? Who do they impact, if there are any?
You can hear me?
Loud
Yes,
and
we can
clear.
hear you. Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, regarding unemployment issue, 6 months after they took power, the GRS government I don't see any indication they're actually taking any concrete measures to reduce the number of people unemployed, either inherited from previous government or because of the COVID and they lost a lot of job, the loss of job. So that is very worrying because I know that I know some pilots lost job and then they are now renting shisha at the bar. And you imagine if you are a pilot, suddenly your life become like that. That will be very hard. Now at this moment, I am now in Kundasang with the mountain guide and also vegetable growers, and their life is severely affected ever since the COVID, and nothing. There's no again. There is no policy or any programs actually to retrain them or to give them new skills so that they can actually have a alternative livelihood. These are native people. And I also went to the coastal area where the Bajau and other native people lives, and the situation is no much better. And the most important, like I already said in my conclusion, the state government, the new government in 6 months in power, need to speed up their act. They need to get that vaccine, get that 1.9 million labor force, Sabah labor force vaccinated so they can start to work, go out and cross the district. That is not something impossible. So it's just that they want to do it, don't want. And if they're not doing it, well, I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm, I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you, Bila. Yeah, I concur with Dr. Tracy and Dr. James. But as for me, I'm looking at the, I believe that the young people should do something, should be there to become the agents of change, where they have to look beyond of the sentiment, but rather look at the policies, issue-centric, and at the same time try to this time around to influence their leaders. And at the same time, I believe that the young leaders that who are directly engaged or involved in politics, they should become the catalyzers of bringing up this new political culture. So in that sense, I suppose that it will open up the increase the level of awareness, and at the same time that increase the political literacies to the people and to all the Sabahan. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's all.
Thank you, Tony. All right, we're really coming to the end of it. I'm going to throw out one last question. New platforms, new engagements, new places to look for different kinds of Sabahans and different kinds of Sabahan narratives. Bridget, would you like to comment on that? I also would like to ask Ben and maybe even Aslam. Any comments on that?
So I think that we have another panel on tomorrow of a very eminent Sabahan speaking.
Thank you. I was going to add to that.
But I would say this. I think that it is important when we bring in the voices of ordinary people to make sure that the communities that are being excluded are having their voices heard, not just from people who speak about them, but also from them themselves. So this involves changing the type of methodologies that we're using. And the one really big challenge about doing research on Sabah is the fact that there's not enough funding for many local scholars to work on issues. There's inadequate, and it's very costly because of the transportation costs to be able to do ethnographic research or things on the ground. And so when I think about new narratives, I think about the need for new paradigms of supporting scholars and working in a different way to make sure that the research can be carried out with a more robust way that actually includes communities of undocumented persons, as well as those people in the very remote areas where those are the concerns are the most pressing, and they're also being left out in the scholarship in many ways.
Thank you for that, Bridget. Thank you very much. Ben?
Oh, thank you for that, Dr. Villa. For me, I think just looking back at sort of like what the elections has gone on, a lot of the spaces that I had looked at before during the course of the campaign have either been taken down or they gone offline. So it sort of indicates that there was a sort of like shake up in the way that these groups are operating, and we're probably going to see some changes to the way that these cyber troopers or even these much higher groups actually going to operate in future elections as well. Because again, it wasn't very as effective as it could be during the course of the Sabah elections. But moving forward, I think it's also sort of like interesting to see how we should be taking a more different lens. I think Dr. Rem earlier talked about how we were looking at all these traditional ways, using surveys and whatnot. And I think that's a very, very important way of trying to understand these issues. But as can be seen, and if you look through the various different chapters in this book, we have so many different approaches, so many different viewpoints, so many different ways of articulating the way that they think about political support. The subtitle of politics of survival really comes to the front here, and that's really something that is going to become even more prominent as we are now grappling with a new generation of people who are going to be in a very, very vulnerable position as a result of COVID-19. People have lost livelihoods, people have to change the way that they are making a living. Their livelihoods have been completely upended as a result of that. So new discussions, new ways of approaches will definitely become more important, and ways of collecting data is also going to evolve quite a bit. What I had done for this election may have been seen as something that was a little bit out there, but moving forward with everybody moving things to be online, social distancing requirements and whatnot, these are ways in which we will have to integrate a lot of these approaches to conduct research in the future. So that's really what I'm very, very cautiously optimistic of how we can improve going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And my friend Aslam, our ally, another ally from the other side, we, your friends on this side of the East, would like to ask you to bring us home. What do you have to say in closing?
Oh, I noticed in most of the chapters actually mention about the issue of irregular migrants in Sabah. So not just in our chapter, apparently. So it means that, this is an ongoing issue that has not been solved, and it probably cannot be solved anytime soon. But I think we also need to reflect about this, giving voices to these vulnerable group of people, especially the undocumented people in Sabah, because many people have this perception that these irregular migrants or undocumented people, they're not Sabahans, they're not Malaysians, they don't belong there. Whereas, what happens is they've been there for generations. So I think moving forward, we also need to include, the voices of these undocumented people, because they are part of Sabahan society, and they form a big portion of Sabahan population. So I think this is what what we need to do in moving forward.
Thank you very much for that, Aslam. And to also add to Aslam, I think also to bear in mind that we like to think about Sabah issues in silo. We think that a lot of them are separated and they don't impact other communities that are around it. But Sabah lives on a spectrum of impact and, levels in which that really affect each other in very, very various but strong, impactful ways. I think if anything, I'm hopeful that this book informs us of the various ways in which the challenges, the oppressions, the hopes, the livelihoods, and future hopes of Sabah can really grow. It helps us understand that it lives on a spectrum, and that actually the dynamics of reading Sabah should be something that is not just read by Sabahans alone, not just by our friends next door in Sarawak, but certainly by all of Malaysia, because equal partners. Thank you very much, everyone, for allowing me to guide the discussion and the conversation. Back to you, Dr. Benjamin Loh, and goodbye, everybody, and blessed Ramadan.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Villa. Our program today has come to an end. I'd like to give a very, very warm regards and big show of gratitude and thank you to all our speakers today for taking the time to attend today's event. Special mention to, of course, our guest lecturers and speakers who took time out of their busy schedules to sort of like give us some very, very kind introductory words and launch off this event today. This has been, we've gone a little bit over time, so I am very, very thankful that you guys stuck around here. So that is it for today from here, all of us here at Taylor's University, University of Malaysia, Sabah, and also University of Nottingham, Malaysia. We are ending this event. Thank you for coming for today. Have a blessed Ramadan and a good weekend ahead. Goodbye, everyone.